Hello and welcome back to Rockanory, the Jackanory for music lovers. I'm back earlier than I thought I would be because obviously the plan was to do weekly readings, but there are no rules. This is Rockanory, not Jackanory. So and the reason that I'm back so soon is because I want to read a little bit more of Nick Kent's wonderful piece about Iggy Pop, some of which I read on the first reading. So. If you want, you can watch that. So just you sort of get the flow, and because I finished the last reading, which was the first video I uploaded on this channel, just up to the point of they're about to make Raw Power, sort of in honour of Iggy Pop, Iggy and the Stooges bank holiday gigs at Hammersmith Apollo, the last of which is tonight, May the 2nd, May the 3rd, May the 3rd. And I went along last night and I have to say, it was so exciting, obviously, Iggy never disappoints, but it really did add another dimension to kind of have Nick Kent's amazing kind of florid language rolling around in my head, after having just read his piece, which is included in the DEUX stuff. And again, I will include a link under the video to buy that book if you haven't got it already, which I'm sure as a discerning music lover you've probably got it on your shelf already. But yeah, so as I say, if you're going along tonight to that gig, or even if you're not, it's just fantastic to have Nick Kent's amazing words about Iggy rolling around in your head. It sort of does add something. So anyway, I'm gonna. If you have watched the other video first, you'll have gathered that Iggy and James Williamson, the guitarist, have just arrived in London, and they've just signed with Tony DeFries and secured a deal with Columbia Records, and they're about to make Raw Power. So that's where we are now, and they're about to recruit Ron and Scott Ashton again. Of course, everyone they tried to play with was lacking in some requirement or other, so after a couple of months, Iggy imported his old Stooges buddies, Ron and Scott Ashton, over to round out the sound. These two had been raised in Iggy's own little Michigan suburb, Ann Arbor, mostly by their mother, Ann, after their father, a Marine Corps pilot, had died while both were still in their early teens. So they weren't too strong on discipline, having been left to pretty much run wild since puberty. That said, Ron was by far the more responsible of the two. In fact, he was the real straight arrow of the Stooges where drugs were concerned. His brother, well, let's start by saying that Scotty Ashton was the youngest, sweetest, and most hopeless member of the Stooges. If Terry Malloy, the valiant simpleton Marlon Brando portrayed in On the Waterfront, had been plucked from his place in the Dockland conflicts of the 50s and restationed one whole decade later in the suburbs of Michigan, where he would come to find his destiny in bashing out primitive rhythms on a set of drums he'd later end up pawning to further feed his love of substance abuse, well, that was pretty much Scott Ashton for you. He even had a bit of that Brando-esque noble savage look about his features, which peered out, adopting looks of casual menace from behind two lank curtains of greasy black hair. But mostly, he resembled a hardcore biker type, pondering his next act of imminent barbarism. Scott's talent for creating mayhem was also something to be considered. His pièce de résistance in this area had to be the time in 1971, when he drove the Stooges bus, with all their equipment inside, under a 12-foot-high bridge without considering the fact that the vehicle he was piloting measured over 16 feet in height. Talk about raising the roof. The resulting crash sent all the occupants and their cargo spilling out onto the highway, breaking all the instruments, injuring several people, and basically putting paid to the Stooges' immediate future. After a while Iggy hadn't particularly wanted to see Scott again, but at the same time he knew that without his bone-headed percussive attack and the presence of his spoiled brother, the Stooges just wouldn't be, well, the Stooges. So they were back in, but neither was at all pleased about having to play second banana to guitarist Williamson's abrasive arrogance. Iggy called James Williamson his secret weapon, and that's exactly what he was, at least in a musical sense. He played his guitar so intensely hard, but both his hands were a constant blur. In fact, at his best, he played guitar just as fast and as loose as the way he lived his life, which was always very fast and loose indeed. The Stooges were quite obsessive in their quest to constantly project an overtly delinquent persona, but Williamson was the only bona fide delinquent of the four, to the point where he'd actually got locked up in reform school for stealing cars and speed-taking in his early teens. After his release, he'd gone on to establish himself as one of Detroit's most powerful young guitarists and one of its most notorious junkies. Iggy had him right by his side because he wanted a Keith Richards kind of guy, carrying half the creative weight in the Stooges, playing guitar riffs that hit the listener like kidney punches. But he also deeply admired the way James could project this image of withering malevolence. Evil was much on his mind at the time. He'd walk around the streets of London in his leopard skin jacket and Beatles boots, and all he could feel was hatred in his heart for this whole slow-witted, conniving world he'd been born into. All this cute shit, this glam rock, was selling up a storm over in Limeyland, and all it was a bunch of wimp pop, written by more cynical hack cocksuckers and sung by talentless dorks wearing too much makeup, who were too dumb and lame to even be mistaken for real faggots. Over in America, they were lapping up this homogenised crap by the Eagles and all these other clowns singing about feeling like Jesse James and James Dean and pretending they're modern-day rock and roll outlaws, when in reality they're just another bunch of denim-draped, self-obsessed, faux hayseed hippie morons. Meanwhile, the Stooges were in exile in this pissant island, unloved and living in the shadow of David fucking Bowie, whose manager they shared suddenly seemed to consider them less like one of his clients, more like some vague afterthought. There was such poison in his heart, so much rage, and such a deep loathing of mankind in general, that it just flooded into the creative marrow of the Stooges' greatest creation, the body of songs that got released on an album entitled Raw Power. There was an extract of Howling Spleen entitled Your Pretty Face is Going to Hell, about a girl he'd known called Joanna who he'd become infatuated with, even though she'd treated him scornfully. Still, now she was losing her looks, so screw you, sister. But mostly, it was one man's rumination on his own loveless exiled condition. The track straight after that had him crooning to some imaginary pretty baby about danger, disease, and nothingness. The final number was entitled simply Death Trip. By the same token, the sound they created was obscenely alive, real raging two-fisted, hellfire sonic abandon. If Iggy, Williamson, and later David Bowie hadn't made such a mess of the mix, it would have been the best and blackest rock and roll album ever made, if only for the title track, Iggy's definitive Oh Mine salute to the great swamp from whence all elemental energies came. They were so good, and yet destiny was once again not following through with the right breaks. They spent almost the whole of 1972 in London, yet apart from recording Raw Power, they only got to play one show there, at a cinema in King's Cross. It was a breathtaking performance, but anyone there could have told you that the kind of provocative, confrontational sensory assault the group specialised in would never be accepted by the timid Brits, who were still into the glazed eyes and flared-trousered semi-stupor of the late hippie era that would only be rendered obsolete 4 years later, when punk happened. Talking of which, one John Lydon was also lurking in the audience that night, and evidently took home some pointers from the spectacle for future reference. Anyway, the Stooges relocated to Los Angeles by the beginning of 1973 in readiness for Raw Power's release in the early spring of that year. They got set up in a big house right on top of the Hollywood Hills, right there in the heart of the city that loves to corrupt. The Stooges loved to be corrupted, so you can probably imagine what happened next. It began with hard drugs and quickly moved to underage girls. Hollywood was suddenly crawling with these packs of 14-year-old girls stoned on their mothers' tranquilizers and waving their fathers' credit cards all over the place in hot pursuit of sexy, emaciated-looking rock dudes to have sex with. The teenage lust factor was considerable, of course, and it was partly their way of rebelliously extending the permissive standards of the 60s, but it was also a hell of a lot to do with wreaking revenge on their inconsiderate and usually divorced parents. Most of the girls were only seen on the weekends when they weren't constrained by school schedules, but there was a hardcore bunch who didn't feel compelled to attend school at all. They'd always get the manager of whatever rock group they were having sex with to write them an absentee note and hang out along the Sunset Strip 7 days a week. These were the girls that the Stooges became particularly close with. I'm going to leave it there because it looks like I'm running out of time, but again, that was Nick Kent's piece on Iggy Pop, and you can find that in the Dark Stuff, which is his collected writings on Faber. And if you're going to see Iggy and the Stooges tonight at Hammersmith, have a fantastic, wonderful time. And of course, James Williamson is on guitar as well, so it's extremely exciting, and also just great to have Nick Kent's words in your head enhances the experience as only it can. So tune in again, stay tuned and subscribe. It would be lovely to have you on board on the Good Ship Rockanory, and I'll see you soon.